So let's talk about the ways that we can get the most models for the least amount of money. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop, but today we're also about getting the most miniatures on the tabletop in the first place. Warhammer 40k has always been a reasonably expensive hobby in terms of the amount of money you put down for the very nice and detailed little figurines that we put on the tabletop. It's a price I'm personally perfectly willing to pay, as I enjoy the modelling, painting, and of course the games. But that doesn't mean that we can't try and get the best bang for our buck in terms of cool miniatures to flesh out our armies, to try and get the most cool stuff on the tabletop for our hobby budget. In this video we'll take a look at the various different sources for how we can get 40k miniatures to use in games, a little about which miniatures and sets might be a bit better to target, how to get more out of each box set, and some discussion around what do you actually need out of a miniature, and considerations for reselling. So quite a lot of topics there. We'll go over everything quite briefly today, and we will be focusing on miniatures rather than books or paints, which are kind of separate topics in themselves. I've had a fair amount of experience with the buying and selling of model soldiers, as I used to make a little bit of money buying and selling people's used miniature armies on eBay. It certainly helped me have a decent stream of income when I was a student, and kept me collecting 40k, essentially for free on the side. At some point I'll probably hope to do a whole series on buying and selling model soldiers, but we'll start with this for now. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so first let's take a look at all of the sources where we can buy miniatures from, and the relative merits and disadvantages of using each one. First of all, and most obviously, we've got Games Workshop themselves. Now, I'll be honest, I very rarely actually buy things directly from Games Workshop these days, almost entirely because the third-party independent retailers that sell Games Workshop products, such as Element Games and the like, sell exactly the same thing, but with a 20% discount. So unless there's something that I'd actually want right at that moment, these guys always trump Games Workshop for me. Buying and collecting Warhammer's already really expensive, so I don't personally feel any need to not save that additional 20%, as there'll still be lots of money going back to Games Workshop, and it helps me support my local wargaming store, which is something I really want to do because I want to be able to go there to be able to play games of 40k. For me personally, the local stores tend to have better gaming table space than Games Workshops themselves, though that might vary depending on what happens to be in your local area. The times when I'll use Games Workshop more often are if there are things that are only available through Games Workshop. I believe that there used to be a lot of direct order things that you could only get from Games Workshop itself, though to my knowledge I think that they're allowing their third-party retailers to order in things that are usually direct only, things like old kits such as the Space Marine Whirlwind. Don't 100% quote me on that because I haven't actually ever used that myself yet, but I have recently heard that that is an option. The main advantage of Games Workshop is that they'll likely get your products to you very quickly, and they do genuinely have very good customer service, and they will generally be very happy to accept returns if the miniature or book wasn't in the right condition when it got to you, which can certainly be a factor if you're thinking about buying something from Citadel Finecast, which is well known to be having all sorts of strange deformities, so it might well be worth ordering from Games Workshop, so you have access to easy and freely available returns and replacements. Along with Games Workshop, we of course have Forge World. In the past, their prices always used to be astronomically higher than Games Workshop's, but with recent Games Workshop price increases, they're getting more and more similar. Obviously, if you're going to be wanting the big Forge World resin kits, then it is the only place to go. I personally have never bought anything from Forge World aside from, I think it was an upgrade pack with Graviton guns to use as grav guns, as that was the cheapest place I could find something to adequately represent grav guns for my Space Marines back in 7th when they were good. I do have quite a lot of things that use Forge World rules, but I've generally been able to convert quite well the things that I needed. For example, I have a Redemptor Dreadnought that's magnetized up with big autocannon arms that I use as a Leviathan Dreadnought, and some Earthshaker platforms that are Basilisk turrets mounted on a converted ground-based platform, and they can be magnetized on and off the actual basilisks. To be honest, quite a lot of Forge World things can just be adequately converted from Games Workshop's kits that they come out with. I'd mainly only use Forge World if there was something that's just so unique or different looking that I couldn't convert it myself. So for example, things like Tau Tetras, for example, there would be something that would be quite hard to convert, compared with their Space Marine Assault Cannon Razorback turrets, which I feel I could happily convert myself from spare bits. Next we move on to the third-party stockists for Games Workshop themselves, and they're usually the place that I'd typically go for my new model kits. They typically have anywhere between a 10 and 25% discount depending on the store. A lot of the stores are just online order stores, but you have a lot of them that are brick and mortar stores as well. I tend to use these a lot at the moment whenever I want new kits. The only issues with them are that sometimes you have to wait for Games Workshop to actually send them the things that they are supposed to send them. They do have a little bit of a history of being a bit slow with getting these new kits to their third-party stockists just because of difficulties with distribution. Games Workshop occasionally have other ways that they sell miniatures. The biggest recent one that I can think of is the Warhammer Conquest magazine, which particularly in some of the first few issues had some ridiculously amazing deals for getting some hands on some certain easy to build miniatures, and also some hobby supplies such as paints and plastic cutters. I think that they had a deal for the first 4 issues in that series. You paid something like £22 for the first 4 issues, and you got something like 15 Space Marine and Death Guard miniatures, about 5 paints, a paintbrush, and some plastic cutters. I wound up buying 2 sets of those so I could actually make functioning squads out of the Space Marine miniatures, and I resold all the Death Guard stuff online to help cover even more of the costs. That was honestly probably some of the best deal Warhammer that I've ever got through a Games Workshop source. Things like this can also crop up on eBay, say for people who are doing exactly what I was doing and selling off the bits that they didn't want, or just people who are buying the magazine to resell in and of itself, as you certainly could have done that if you'd wanted to. It meant that I saw a lot of paints going on eBay for incredibly cheap, just because there had been large numbers of them shipped out in those Conquest magazines. Bit sellers and stores are another good way to get specific parts for your models. There's quite a lot of stores that just sell literally Games Workshop bits from new kits. They'll typically have a selection of the different parts from any given kit, and will charge you the price for the individual part that you're looking for. This can be quite useful because if, say, all you are looking for is an alternate gun for your Lehman Russ turret, then this could be far more valuable than buying an entire new Lehman Russ, even if you did have to pay something quite expensive for it, say 5 or 10 quid. You could then either re-glue or magnetize it, so your tank would have both options and not have to assemble yourself an entire another tank just to get a different option. Of course, you'll find most of these bits also on eBay as well, and in all honesty, eBay does tend to be a bit more reliable in having them, because the popular bits on these bit stores get sold out very, very quickly indeed, which means you might struggle to find exactly the part that you want. One time that I definitely used bit stores to good effect was when I bought a whole ton of Space Marine Scout bodies with camo cloaks for use in my Astra Militarum, and I converted up a bunch of Astropaths and Psychers, using those nice robed bodies as a base. Buying those bits was a lot cheaper than buying the full metal models would have been, as some of those cost a ton of money from Games Workshop for the amount of miniatures that you get. Sticking in with eBay, we have of course eBay second-hand miniatures, which is a huge topic all in itself, and is something that obviously I have a lot of experience with. The quality of the things on eBay can really vary a lot. I'd be tempted to buy things that have very good pictures of them, so you can tell exactly what sort of miniatures you're getting. Different things can be useful at different levels. You can use second-hand miniatures just to get some very cheap models to flesh out an army, maybe do a little bit of retouching on them, maybe spray and repaint, or consider paint stripping them if they're old and a bit battered. Personally, I tended to go down the spray over and repaint, provided someone hadn't absolutely caked them in a whole load of acrylic already. Second-hand minis can also be great for getting already assembled or already painted forces on the tabletop, as it will actually save you a lot of time getting models onto the battlefield if you can find someone who's already assembled the model well, or has already painted it in a scheme that you're happy that you would want to run alongside your army. Say if you just wanted the standard Dark Angels colour scheme, then buying a Rhino off eBay that's already painted in the same Dark Angels colour scheme could potentially save you quite a lot of time. On eBay you'll get a lot of people who are just selling a big army as a job lot, and these will be the places that you typically get the best deals off eBay, because in reality it's not always very likely that someone's going to want, say, 3 scout squads, a Rhino and a Dreadnought for those specific miniatures to add to their army. So say if you wanted the scout squads, you could buy that set and then maybe re-eBay the Dreadnought and the Rhino separately, which could wind up with you getting the scout squads at a very low rate indeed, although obviously this does take a little bit of extra work. I'd be a little wary of any very fragile miniatures with eBay. Some people know how to package and post miniatures a lot better than others, but the vast majority of the time, in my experience, pretty much anything that I've bought off eBay has been easily fixable with a few dabs of plastic glue. In theory, you should be able to return anything that's significantly not as described with eBay, and I have done so for some sellers on occasion, or occasionally you can ask for a partial refund if some of your miniatures are badly damaged. That's definitely the exception and not the rule though. I just have a look at the eBay seller's rating. If they've got a feedback score of 98% or more, then you know that at least the vast majority of the time, they do get the things as described to the buyer. Moving on, we mentioned pre-painted miniatures off eBay a second ago, and there are commission painters out there who will happily assemble and paint your entire army for a cost. I'm afraid this isn't something that I've got any personal experience in, as I generally like to have my own colour scheme on my miniatures, but for those of you with certainly a lot more money than time out there, this is certainly a valid option and can get you a great looking force on the tabletop, and you'll generally get a quality depending on the cost that you're prepared to pay. Assembling and painting models does actually take a really large amount of time if you're trying to do it as any sort of business venture, so costs for these things are always going to be reasonably high. Another big and potentially one of the cheapest sources are buying and trading from people in the local area. Lots of Facebook sites have a buy, sell and swap page, often associated with local areas or clubs in the region, and honestly this is probably one of the places where you could get the most good deals, as you're not competing against the general market, say as you would be on eBay. This will obviously take a bit of negotiating with whoever is trying to sell their models. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying I would pay that amount for them if you wanted to get rid of them, and they certainly don't need to take you up on any offer, though I would try and offer them a fair price, obviously if they're people that you're going to know and still want to remain friends with. I can't say I've used local Facebook groups that much in terms of acquiring miniatures, as it is just a little bit random as to what's going to come up with them. But it is worth keeping your ear to the ground if anything that you do really want suddenly manifests itself, and you might be able to get it at a significant discount. As well as this, you can also swap miniatures with other people who you know, and in particular trading spare parts is a great idea. Say if you desperately need a power fist for one of your Space Marine captains but don't have any, there might well be a player in your area who has absolutely tons of power fists and is happy just to give you them for free. So it's worth having good communication with other people who you play with in your local area, as it can solve a lot of simple problems. Next we have third-party miniatures in themselves, so things that either slightly ape Games Workshop products, or are sort of trying to do their own thing, but could adequately represent miniatures in the Games Workshop game. Some of the most common third-party miniatures that I've seen are different regiment options for Imperial Guard. Obviously they'll be called different things, but they'll have obvious similarities to say Death Corps models, or Valhallans or something like that. Games Workshop can't really patent the concept of World War I infantry in space with fancy space guns, so that's why a lot of third-party companies have jumped in to cover the gaps, particularly as Games Workshop haven't supported their Imperial Guard regiment lines very well at all. You'll see a whole load of other things that are similar to this, things that look very similar to Space Marines, very similar to Battle Sisters, and all sorts of funky demonic things. Things like Anvil Industries and Victoria miniatures, and Creature Caster are all common sources of these. They do tend to have a reasonable price tag though, they aren't going to be significantly cheaper than Games Workshop products for the most part, if you are looking for fairly high detailed miniatures. In addition, there's things like Shapeways and other sites that make you individual bits or upgrade parts. I've seen them do things like Imperial Knight weapons or chapter iconography for shoulder pads, so they can provide some cool upgrades to your models without having to fork out for the sometimes fairly extortionate rates of Games Workshop chapter upgrade packs, where you really don't get all that much plastic for the amount of money that you spend. Finally, we come on to the thorny topic of recasters, industrious people all over the world who take Games Workshop products and illegally recast them in resin and sell them to you over the internet. I don't endorse them and I've never used them myself, as these things are Games Workshop's IP, and if you really want the miniature so badly, then you should probably just pay the price for it that it's being sold for, or pass it up and allow Games Workshop to know that you won't be buying it because of how much it costs. I do sort of think that Games Workshop are partly to blame for the proliferation of recasters who do this, just because they charge so much for such small amounts of plastic occasionally. In particular, I have seen people who have used this for the bigger Forge World kits, and things where the cost per point ratio is incredibly high, such as Orc Smasher Guns for example. For me, it's just not worth getting into some iffy legal territory, as well as the downside of not being able to resell your models on eBay after you're done with them, because if they're recast then you should certainly be saying that, and that's probably not something you want to publicise online. I know we could talk for hours about the dubious ethics of recasting, but let's leave it there for now. So let's go over some of the other things that we need to consider when we're buying and selling models. Firstly, it helps to target the miniatures that we most want to buy, and there are certain things that certainly make me a lot more likely to buy a kit, particularly Games Workshop's discount boxes, such as the Start Collecting boxes and the Army vs Army sets they've come out with. They usually offer a decent discount, and I'll often wait until one of these comes out if there's a certain miniature that I want, buy that set and then resell the other bits to eBay. One example that worked out well for me was Tooth and Claw, the Space Marines vs Genestealer Cult box set that's now out of print. I used that one to get all of the aggressors that I own, as that was the first time that they ever appeared in a big discount box set. Easy build kits are certainly another valid option for keeping costs down. Anything from those snap fit Imperial Guardsmen that are the cheapest way to add extra lasguns to your Imperial Guard battle line if you want the new models, or things like the easy build Redemptor Dreadnought, which costs only 2/3 of its multi-part cousin. If you don't want the options of different poses and different weapon options, and would rather just save a little bit of money, then these are really good shouts. One thing to note is that older sculpts tend to be a lot cheaper than newer sculpts on the whole, so if you could be equally happy with an older miniature, you'll typically save more. I quite like the way that Games Workshop rebalances things, so older things every so often do rise to the height of the competitive meta, and become perfectly viable to run again. Finally, I'd also consider the cost in pounds to points ratio if you're looking at collecting a 2,000 point army or something. Some units are just extortionately expensive in terms of the amounts of money that you put down for the amounts of points that you get on the battlefield. The Orc mech guns are one of the worst examples of this. You're almost paying £1 sterling for 1 point in game, which means that theoretically if you were building a 2,000 point army and you were buying all kits that are that bad value, that should cost you £2,000. If you're looking at it in a bit of a utilitarian way, then to get your 2,000 point army, you might want to prioritise some of the units that will get you there a bit faster for a little bit less money, even if maybe they're not the perfect thing that might be most optimised, or even if they might look just a little bit less good on the tabletop. If and when you have bought a box of Warhammer, it's important to try and stretch the value as far as you can. Any bits that you don't use on the box, ideally you should keep. Having new conversion options can let you make certain miniatures from scratch, and you never really quite know what's going to come in handy further down the line. I have a few plastic trays that are divided into different segments, where I store spare guns, spare melee weapons, that sort of thing, and it really does let me just build some miniatures almost entirely from scratch, or it lets me magnetize something new to represent a new option that becomes more attractive in the future. One example of that was Genestealer Cult Hand Flamers. They went down to 1 point in the last codex, and as luck would have it I had over 20 flamers from various kits already there, so I attached them to various pistols and things, allowing me to churn out a squad of hand flamers very quickly. If you have the ability and time, I would certainly consider magnetizing your miniatures. Particularly in 8th edition, the points of things go up, down and all over the place, particularly with each chapter approved, and something that might be the absolute most optimal build now is not necessarily going to be that in the future. It really did take me a while to get my head around magnetizing miniatures, but now there's barely a single kit that comes my way that I won't magnetize all of the weapon options on. It does take time, but as the game changes so quickly and I intend to be collecting 40k long into the future, it saves a lot of time and effort by chopping up and re-gluing my various miniatures. Probably the biggest single win out of all of my magnetizing ventures have been my magnetized Lehman Russ tanks. They can have sponsons or not sponsons, can change out any of the sponson weapons, and change out the main guns to have battle cannons or demolish cannons or all sorts of things. They're one of the units that really has changed a lot in terms of the best ways to field them over 8th edition, and being able to experiment with things between games means that games get a little bit more interesting. If there are ways that you can field certain miniatures in different ways, then that's also a good idea. Standard Guardsmen are one of the ones that can really fill out a bunch of different roles. You could use them as Guardsmen, as Genestealer Cult Brood Brothers or Neophytes, or perhaps even Chaos Cultists. One thing that can help with this if you have some models that you include in the squad only if they're being fielded in a certain way, such as say a few spot models with chaos icons on if you're fielding them as chaos cultists, or maybe some nice gentlemen to lead them with extra arms if you're fielding them in Genestealer cults. Having your own custom paint scheme is also a pretty decent idea in terms of utility of the models, because say if you just paint them as Ultramarines, you might get some funny reactions from people if you say want to try them out with Salamanders rules or something like that. Personally, I really don't mind too much what rules the army is using, provided the war gear is representative, and bonus points if it looks great on the table, but some people do get a bit annoyed if you're using completely different rules to an army that you've clearly painted as, say, Ultramarines, when you're playing a game against them. Finally, conversions are a really good way to allow you to field different options on the table. I've already mentioned my converted Leviathan Dreadnought that's made out of a Redemptor plus a bunch of fancy autocannon bits from Imperial Knights, and of course he's magnetized so he can be fielded as a regular Redemptor as well should I wish to. Anything with a similar chassis can be very useful for converting stuff on, say the Space Marine Rhino chassis. I've made myself some custom Whirlwind turrets, so with the aid of some magnets I can field my Rhinos as Whirlwinds or Razorbacks as well, without ever having to fork out for an actual Whirlwind kit. Obviously not everything's going to be particularly easy to convert. Sometimes you just might not be able to do a good enough job to have it adequately represent the miniature on the tabletop, so it is a bit of a trade-off, and it likely won't look perfect unless you're incredibly talented, but it's certainly an option that I would consider. Going back to the mech guns, which I seem to be talking about a lot in this video, the Orc background is that they're basically made up of bits of scrap, so I've thrown together some fairly decently convincing mech guns with some Gretchen models crewing them. They're the right size and they clearly show what they are on the tabletop, and I've never had anyone say anything but good things about the cool conversions on the tabletop, or talk down at me for not having bought the very expensive models. Next, we'll talk about thinking hard about the level of utility that you need when you're buying models that might help you choose between the different sources. Second-hand miniatures off eBay are generally cheaper, so if you could get by with using them, you're likely to save yourself a lot of money. Some things I think it makes sense to buy the new kit, particularly when you want different options to magnetize, or if they're going to be big centerpiece units of your army and you want to paint them up real nice. Other things though, people just genuinely do not care if they are a little bit paint-caked or aren't assembled absolutely perfectly. One example of that are my Imperial Guard infantry, which exclusively come second-hand on eBay. I didn't paint strip them, just resprayed them, and did the best job I could over the top of the paintwork available. Quite a lot of them look absolutely fine, no worse than they would have been if they'd been bought new. Admittedly, some of them aren't perfect. They're either assembled a bit weird or have lost a little bit of detail due to having a bit too much paint on them. But honestly, when you're fielding a huge horde of guardsmen, really no one cares or even looks too hard about them. Generally the visual spectacle is still pretty impressive just by rank after rank of uniformly painted infantry. I've even won some best painted army things at tournaments in armies that included those same guardsmen, just because the big centerpiece models were all big and quite snazzy, and no one really looked too hard at the fairly unimpressive painting and modelling on the grunts. If you're using huge amounts of ranked infantry, I would absolutely think about buying them second hand. Next, we've already said, could you convert the miniature? If so, then it's a way up of whether or not you spend your time and effort converting, or whether you buy the new kit or new parts. Different people have different levels of time or things that they would be comfortable trying to attempt as a project, so that's entirely down to your own circumstances. Time to arrival is also another thing, as we mentioned. Games Workshop's probably likely to be the fastest as it's directly from the source. I tend to try and be a little bit patient and go through the third-party stockists, and also you might have to wait a little while for exactly what you want to turn up on eBay or in a local group. Basically, the longer that you're prepared to wait for the thing, the greater the chance that you have of getting it at a better deal. Another one is if you want to have all the options available on the kit to magnetize, or to build it the exact way that you'd like it to be. Obviously, new is going to be the easiest for that, and second-hand or easy-to-build miniatures are likely to restrict you. I do find that if you are planning to be in 40k for a very long time, then it's going to be better to try and make the effort to magnetize as you go along, if you possibly can. But if you think that it might not be something that you're into a few years down the line, then maybe just buying the kit, gluing and assembling it how you want it to use it at the moment is perfectly valid, and if you do feel the need to change later, then it's usually going to still be possible with some extra modelling work. How good the kit looks and how well it's made are also considerations. Newer kits are often a bit prettier than the older ones, and things might not quite be as well assembled on eBay compared with how you could manage yourself, but on the other hand you can also pay for proper custom paint jobs or people to have pre-made your models for you, if you're buying them off someone off eBay who's done a good job. My final tip is that being able to resell your models after you've finished with them is one of the biggest things with how cheap your hobby will be overall. Being able to resell bits, entire models, or parts of kits that I don't want is one of the things that's let me keep Warhammer costs down while still acquiring fun new models over the years. You can potentially get loads of money back either by selling a certain special weapon that you've decided that you didn't need. For example, when the Skitari kit came out, I remember reselling a couple of plasma calivers for something like £8 each, which was just ludicrous as the whole kit was something like £17 or £18 at the time. Also, it can help you get the most out of those value boxes if you just harvest the bit that you want from the kit and then resell the rest back to the internet. Or on eBay, if you're buying a big pre-used army and say you really want all the infantry but want to resell the tanks, then that can keep you from acquiring models that you didn't really need and paying for them. There are a couple of things to bear in mind with reselling though. I would only ever resell models that you put your time and effort and painting into if you are absolutely 100% certain that you are not going to want them in the future, even if it could be years down the line and you're regretting selling your Space Marine army because all of a sudden their rules have got great again. It's going to cost you far more to reacquire all of those models that you wanted again, and loads of your time to repaint and remodel them. I tend to be one of the types that tends to keep their armies as they go along. I have resold bits and bobs over the years, particularly on small armies where I've definitely decided that the project is finished and I don't want to expand that army. And I certainly resell books at the last moment where I think that yes, I could probably get by without them for a bit and they're likely to get a replacement sometime soon. But having a large stockpile of miniatures gives me a ton more options to play with when I am playing games. When you're assembling the models, most of the time you're not going to be thinking about when you eventually stop using the model, but it is worth bearing in mind that people aren't going to pay half as much for the model if it isn't in some state resembling what it was when it was bought. It might be fun to do a converted human auxiliary force for the Tau Empire where everyone's armed with pulse rifles, but there's going to be a very limited market for that when you resell it, because it doesn't really represent anything that's actually off the boxes in 40k. Obviously, if you're insane at conversion work and painting, then you might well be able to get just as much for it as you bought it for. But in my experience, I've had quite a lot of Imperial Guard miniatures come my way over the years that have had some weird and unique conversions, and now they'll never really resell. So I just use those models to acquire different bits for when I am making more guardsmen myself. Reselling models on eBay is a really big subject, and it's one that I could do lots of videos on. If you'd be interested in hearing more like that, please let me know down in the comments. At some stage I probably will be getting round to making a series on it, but the schedule is pretty busy at the moment with all the tactics videos, so I guess we'll see. I know for a fact that this is by no means a completed list. If you can think of any other good tactics with buying and getting more value out of the Warhammer kits as well as the stuff that I've listed here, please let us all know down in the comments. A lot of this stuff just really isn't the most obvious to newer players, who obviously don't have as much experience and can often wind up finding starting the hobby a very expensive experience indeed. And I'd like to remove as many barriers to entry as possible, as it's good to have more players in the game. Thanks very much for listening to Auspex Tactics. We'll be continuing with our regularly scheduled tactics videos tomorrow, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear more of that. I also have a Patreon page. If you are finding my videos useful to you, please feel free to support the channel for however much you think the videos have value to you. The link is down in the description below. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.